Well, the global economy is entering the new year with rising geopolitical tensions looming over its prospects as the world's leading central banks attempt to cut interest rates after the worst inflation shock in decades. Donald Trump's second term in the White House is expected to dominate the economic agenda. Global trade tensions are on the horizon as the president-elect threatens to impose sweeping tariffs on U.S. imports. Britain's economy is faltering while inflationary pressure remains. The largest economies of the Eurozone are engulfed in political turmoil. Beijing is battling to revive the Chinese economy, while countries in the global south are facing soaring debt interest payments. Well, let's talk to an economist and research professor, a friend of the house, Dr. Andrew Melvin. He joins me live from Texas, Dallas, Texas, in the United States. Thank you so much. Happy New Year to you. Compliments of the season. It's good to see you, Dr. Melvin.
Tolo, it's always great to see you. Happy New Year. I hope you have a fantastic 2025.
Yeah, I wish you the same. Well, I think we should start with, I've identified some in my introduction, but to you, what are those global issues that you think we need to take a look at or be cautious of as we move on in 2025? We cannot ignore these global issues because no country is isolated. All of these have their effect on the global economy.
Well, let's start with the climate change, which you mentioned exactly. So, I mean, I think that around the world, people are really starting to recognize that this is not just a human issue, it's also an economic issue, and the costs of climate change are immense. I mean, in Nigeria, of course, we had lots of climate-related issues. The flooding in Borno tragically comes to mind. But around the world, what's happening is people are starting to see that there's a huge cost to it. When you have this extreme weather events, you have cost to the cleanup that happens there. You have the emergency management systems in the United States, which are very expensive. And these numbers are starting to add up. It's creating problems in the insurance market in many places around here on that. And I think there's going to be an increasing recognition that the cost of climate change is huge. And of course, part of this, too, related to Nigeria is how is the energy transition going to unfold? I mean, we've talked about it for a long time. It seems to be going slowly, but in fact, in many ways, the energy transition is happening. And like many things in life, it's going to happen because of economic pressures, not necessarily because we pass legislation. So you think of Texas, for example, as an oil and gas producing place. In fact, it makes 3 times as much wind power as any other state in the United States. In Norway, 93% of cars are selling, that they're selling new cars are electric. So this transition is happening despite the fact that we have slow coordination by the governments. And that's another, let's call it possible headwind for Nigeria this year as someone that exports oil and exports gas. You know, we are going to see, as my friend Taiwo always says, we didn't end the Stone Age because we ran out of stone. The oil and gas age is going to come to an end much more rapidly than we think because of economic reasons. And that's another potential headwind in 2025. But one I want to raise that you didn't put into your opening remarks that really is starting to have an impact, we've talked about for a long time, is the demographics. I mean, the reality is that everywhere outside of Africa, the world is rapidly aging. I mean, we have shrinking working age populations in so many countries, including China, including every country in Europe, including Japan, including Korea. On that. I mean, here in the United States, they're starting to recognize there aren't enough young people to go to colleges. So you have a whole large university college system, which is starting to feel real economic pressure on that. And, you know, when we talk about these growth rates, if in China, for example, you have a shrinking working age population, and they say they can't grow 5%. I mean, that number is just a fiction. So the demographics are going to start to bite, and we're going to grow slowly. Now, at one level, maybe that's an opportunity because I've said this, the only place on the planet with more young people is Africa. But for the rest of the world, this is a completely new thing. When I learned economics, it was all about growth. I mean, even when Marx wrote about capitalism, it was all about growth. So we're coming to a world where that growth equation doesn't work when the population is shrinking so fast. So those are 3 big issues I want to put on the table. I'll pause there at this point. There's a few more that I'll raise as well.
Indeed. I would like us to, of course, touch on the crude oil market saga. There's been a lot of talks around our President-elect Trump coming into office and talking about producing more, drilling more oil. Many are saying, what impact could this have on the entire global market and oil market? In recent times, there's been a bit of stability in that market. Do you think that this could cause a shift in prices or whatever in the entire crude oil market globally?
Well, I don't think there's any reason to be optimistic that prices are going to go higher. And as I've always said on your show and elsewhere, Nigeria needs to cope with oil at any price. But it certainly seems when we're trying to move off of oil globally, and there are these alternatives. I mean, wind, solar, of course, geothermal. I mean, lots of work on nuclear. So, I mean, we are going to make an energy transition, and you have a president that's bent on drilling more and reducing the price of oil and gas for Americans. You see that the downside is much bigger than the upside. So, I mean, if $80 oil is something that we've enjoyed over the last few years. We haven't produced enough, though. I know now we're getting a little bit closer to 2 million barrels a day. But I don't think we can expect. We should plan for the possibility that we see oil prices go down, and possibly significantly in 2025 and beyond. As I said, we're going to move off the oil age, I hope, sometime in my lifetime, and I'm old.
So let's now look at worlds beginning to cut interest rates. We've seen that happening already. You know what's happening in Nigeria, been raising interest rates, trying to rein in on inflation and all of that. But let's look at world economies, world central banks trying to cut rates. Do you see Nigeria also looking that route? And how do you see this impacting also the global economy?
Well, I think that interest rates are going to have to come down around the world. I mean, if you look at the United Kingdom, for example, or Canada, I mean, you had low rates for a long time, zero interest rate policies. Then we had the inflation, we had the rapid rise of rates, including the United States. And now, the economies are struggling. The UK may be entering recession. I think one of the reasons, in my view, is the Bank of England has been a little bit slow to cut rates. I think in terms of Nigeria, I mean, the Central Bank of Nigeria has had, I think, been very well led over the last period. We've really introduced a lot of stability into the exchange market. I mean, they've had to raise rates because of inflation. But I could certainly see a scenario in the next, in 2025 and beyond, where we start to bring those rates down. And of course, I mean, it's not sustainable to have 30% inflation forever in Nigeria. We need to bring that rate down. But I mean, we've had effectively exchange rate stability for over a year now. It hasn't moved very much on that. And I do see a scenario where the exchange rate starts to improve. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we ended the year at 1,200, for example.
Will that further affect borrowing costs? That's where I'm really headed. For countries that will need to borrow, do you think this would affect borrowing costs?
Well, I mean, I think that the countries in Africa that are over indebted, I mean, there's no, whether interest rates go up 100 or sort of down 100 basis points isn't going to solve their fundamental problem. I mean, there was a big push, as we know, over the last few decades for countries to borrow, in some cases from China, in some cases from multilaterals, to expand their infrastructure, to invest in infrastructure. In many cases, the infrastructure didn't necessarily deliver the economic growth and the tax revenue, and now they're under real pressure. So, I mean, obviously there's a little bit of relief if interest rates come down and you have floating rates, but in a lot of cases that's not sufficient on that. Now, Nigeria is not in that situation. It's, it exports oil. It has enough dollars, as you said in your segment, or the debt management offices, in my experience, perhaps, I want to say the most professional organization in the country. The country's always paid its debt. Its foreign debt continues to be relatively low versus the size of its economy and earnings. So, for Nigeria, I'm not worried about that extreme debt position. But for other countries in Africa, that's an issue. And reducing interest rates a little bit isn't going to necessarily solve that problem.
If truly the Trump trade war comes up, now looking at clashes with China and, of course, increasing tariffs of up to 60% in some cases, and, of course, you know what's been happening, what he's been saying during the campaign and all of that. If that happens, what does it mean for trade globally, and what impact would that also have on developing nations like Nigeria, of course, African countries?
Well, I think that, this is a very real possibility. I mean, if we go back a little bit, let's ignore for a minute the personalities in this and look at the big economic trends. So there was something called the Washington Consensus, which is a term coined in the 90s, but basically captured the idea advanced by the IMF and by the World Bank and by many business people that internationalization was a good thing. Everyone benefited from trade. There may be some losers along the transition, but we need to expand these trade links on that. What Donald Trump has done is demolished the Washington consensus. He said, actually, we're going to put Americans first. And there is evidence that the American working class lost out in internationalization. And of course, many people in America, one of the primary reason they voted for Trump was they felt left behind economically. And of course, you look at the numbers, the rich have got much richer. The people that benefit from internationalization, so the business people, they get to fly around the world. They go to the WEF conferences. They go to the IMF meetings in Washington. They've had a fantastic time over the last 40 years. But the average American and the average European have not necessarily done so well. So I expect that the United States, given what Donald Trump has said and done in the past, is going to go down this path. And of course, I'm Canadian. We've got the threat of a 25% tariff on Canadian goods, which we've had free trade for decades. We've had the auto pact with the United States for 60 years, which is a huge shock. So the world would go into recession, and companies are already now starting to think about how they revamp their supply chains to do it, and you get the things brought back. Term is reshoring, bringing them back to their country of origin. Of course, reshoring in the last number of years has meant, for example, bringing production back to Mexico, but with a threat on Mexico tariffs in the United States, it means actually bringing it back to the United States, bringing it into the country. So we could go into a recession, and I wouldn't be surprised on that. But that's in fact what Trump has promised, is we will take care of Americans first. Now, in terms of Nigeria, I of course have been the one that has advocated for a long time that we should be exporting services, exporting brains. That's the policy of the vice president. There's been huge progress on that outsourcing Nigeria prospect. I think that's still a viable strategy. Nigeria still has the human capital, as I said, that other countries increasingly don't have. So we need to invest in that. But I think that I've stood on this show many times and said that Nigeria and Africa as a whole needs to have strong commercial and business relationships around the world, with China, with India, with the Middle East, with Europe, with the United States. I'm wondering now whether, in fact, Nigeria is going to be forced more to choose some sides in all of this. I hope that Nigeria will choose for itself. I hope Nigeria chooses to align with the United States and Canada and Europe. It's a big democracy, a messy democracy, but as we've seen in the last years, every country is a messy democracy. But there may be a need to make some choices on that and who to align with. But in terms of the outsourcing strategy, the logical country to align with or countries are, of course, the Western countries. That's where the market for the outsourcing services are.
I think when you talk about African countries coming together, trading together, doing things together, I think that's where the AFCFTA comes up. And years after this agreement was signed, I can say that I've not seen that clear-cut direction talking about how we intend to tap into this market, very large market indeed. You've traveled far and wide. What more do you think can be done? Because the fear is some countries might become a dumping ground. Some countries are high in manufacturing. Some countries have the population. So the question is, how do we balance all of this so that we could begin to get the positives of the AFCFTA? There was a AGOA at a particular time, and from research, Nigeria didn't get enough from this. So that doesn't become the same story.
Well, I said at the time, even before COVID, I was saying very clearly 2017, 2018, that some people were over-optimistic about the AFCFTA. I think AFCFTA is a fantastic development. But again, we have to remember it was part of the 50-year plan from the African Development Bank, the 2013 plans for 2063. These paths to integration of trade take a long time. And the idea that we would have AFCFTA magically have kind of this integrated continental business transition was just a myth. I think in West Africa there is a lot of potential, but one of the things that has not been done that I wish had been done, and I talked about back then, was more linguistic skill. West Africa as a region, of course, for reasons we all understand, it has a French part, has an English part. There isn't enough cooperation, mainly because the English speakers don't speak enough French. So the French speakers tend to learn some English if they want to do business. So if you're in Cote d'Ivoire, want to do business in Ghana, you learn English. The Ghanaians or the Nigerians don't necessarily learn French. So I just think if there was a more of a push at the regional level, and this has been discussed many times. I mean, the idea that we would trade manufacturing goods with Rwanda, for example, that's a long way off. It has a whole other infrastructure. If we're going to go across the continent, we need we need a rail infrastructure to do that. So that is decades away, decade or two or longer. But in terms of West Africa integration, we need to do more. But and of course we have the Lagos to Abidjan highway, which is still under the way, and I think will be very useful. But what would really drive, I think, integration in West Africa is more linguistic ability, more kind of cultural ties, personal human ties between the Francophone countries and the Anglophone countries. And for Nigeria, if you think about, I mean, we tend to think of Ivory Coast, Senegal, because they're relatively advanced. But we've got Mali, Burkina Faso. I mean, these are huge potential markets that are growing. They have their own challenges. But to the extent that we achieve that integration, I think it will also help the peace process. But again, AFCFTA is a long-term play on that. And so, I mean, I hope to see, and I think we still have it, the political will that says Africa is going to work together, and we just continue to take steps. But the idea of a massive change in economic relations over a short period of time is not realistic.
So finally, 2025, globally, looking at employment rates and all that we've seen post-COVID and all of that, what will be your summary for the outlook?
Well, subdued. And let me add one final issue that I do think Nigeria needs to think about is artificial intelligence. So as I said, you know, I was the one that stood up back 7, 8 years ago and said we should be exporting brains out of Nigeria while they remain in Nigeria. But if it turns out that the jobs, for example, coding that we're trading Nigerians for are done by AI, that strategy is not going to work. And it's only 3 years ago that ChatGPT came out with generative AI. It's moving at an incredible pace on that. And I think there needs to be some real thought in Nigeria as we execute this outsourced Nigeria strategy that we're not training young people for disappointment, training them in a skill that a year or 2 or 3 is not going to be used. So we're trying to export brains, but if brains are replaced by AI, that's a big issue. But we will be subdued, as I said, because of the aging population, because, as we've talked about, the geopolitical tensions, because of the increasing cost of the climate challenges. We can't expect a rapid growth rate, and we need to figure out how to have a flourishing world, even if growth outside is subdued. And within that, Nigeria, as you say, needs to figure out our place in it, particularly as we go through this energy transition. And, you know, whether it's 5 or 7 or 10 or 20 years, we're not going to be selling much oil at a high price around the world.
Dr. Andrew Melvin, thank you so very much for your time. It's interesting having you join the show the second day of January 2024. Do enjoy the rest of your day. We appreciate your time.
Thank you, Tolo, and have a great 2025. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, there. Talk to you too soon. He joined us live from Dallas, Texas, United